Do you think the most dangerous place to die is a dark street or a secluded alley? Well, it isn't. That night, death chose an amusement park ride, surrounded by lights, laughter, and families. And worse, no one noticed when it happened. Before I continue, I'll warn you. If you like true stories full of mystery and twists, subscribe to the channel now, like it, and comment at the end with what you think happened. Because what I'm about to reveal will make you rethink everything you know about safety. I'm Jonh Spencer, and I've investigated crimes in places that would keep anyone awake at night. But this one haunted me in a different way. Not just because it was the perfect crime, but because every clue seemed to have been left to tease me. Imagine a killer who acts in front of 7 people, unseen, without leaving a trace, and without making a sound. It's as if he's unconstrained by the rules of the real world. The case began as a banal tragedy, but soon turned into a puzzle that defied logic, time, and even common sense. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, and yet, someone died from a direct hit to the chest. The killer could have been sitting next to the victim, or he might never have entered the ride. And this is where the story begins to get complicated. What you're about to hear isn't just an investigation. It's a journey into the mind of someone capable of turning an innocent stroll into an invisible crime scene. And if you think you've seen it all, wait until you get to the final twist. Because this case proves that in Ghost Train, the biggest scare comes not from the settings, but from the people. I've investigated crimes in all sorts of places, from luxurious mansions to time-forgotten alleys. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the city's old amusement park. That structure seemed frozen in the 1950s, rust on the tracks, peeling paint, a smell of damp wood in the air. The Ghost Train was the most famous attraction, and not because it was fun, but because it carried stories that locals told in hushed tones, as if the park could hear. As I walked down the narrow hallway leading to the entrance, the sound of chains rattling in the wind reminded me of an old investigative rule. Places hold memories, and sometimes they scream louder than any witness. The cold night air clung to my skin like a silent warning. Something in this room didn't want to be forgotten, and I was about to find out why. The park owner, a tired-looking man with calloused hands, greeted me with a weak, almost resigned handshake. "Nobody's touched this place since the accident in the 1970s, he said, looking back at the tracks. I realized it wasn't just the train carrying ghosts. There was something alive there, something that didn't want to be exposed. And when a place tries to hide the truth, it always finds a way to escape." I remember thinking investigating there would be like opening an ancient chest, one that exudes a dense scent of the past. But chests hold treasures and also curses. And in the case of that park, I didn't yet know which of the two I would find. But the first clue was about to appear, and it would come in a much stranger form than I imagined. It was a Saturday during peak season, the kind of night when the park was teeming with visitors. The lights flickered as if competing for attention with the laughter and shouts that echoed in the air. I arrived just before closing, precisely because I knew that the last hours of the day always reveal more than the entire day. It's in the silence that remains after the crowds that secrets begin to spill out. The clock read 10:47 p.m. when the last group boarded the Ghost Train. Among them was Robert Valmont, the victim, who had no idea this would be his final journey. Outside, the full moon seemed to cut through the shadows of the park, creating strange figures among the closed tents. I've learned that crimes don't choose their time, but it's amazing how the darkness seems to invite them. The temperature that night was low, and the fog creeping along the ground gave the scene an extra layer of mystery. The wind bit my face, bringing with it the smell of burnt oil from the tracks. I observed every detail like a painter scrutinizing an unfinished canvas, searching for the mismatched line, the detail that betrayed another artist's hand. The entire park seemed to conspire to hide something. It was in this atmosphere that the train departed on its final journey. Minutes later, darkness and sound effects engulfed the passengers, and I, standing on the platform, still didn't know that when that car returned, the world would have changed forever. Robert Valmont wasn't just a name on a police file. He was the kind of man who left a trail behind him wherever he went. And that trail wasn't always of friends. Tall, imposing, always dressed as if he were about to close a $1 million deal. He had that calculating air that turns any conversation into a negotiation. When I stepped into the park that night and saw him, I realized he wasn't there to have fun. He was there to observe, and those who observe too much usually have plans they don't want others to discover. My experience has taught me that people like Robert collect enemies like others collect stamps. His real estate history was filled with untold stories. Entire neighborhoods demolished to make way for luxury buildings, broken contracts, families evicted. In the park, he was already seen as the man who would sign the death warrant of that tradition. It was easy to imagine a reason for someone to want to silence him. Difficult to figure out who had the courage to follow through. As he walked between attractions, he went unnoticed by those who didn't know him. But to those who knew him, every step sounded like a provocation. He didn't smile, showed no interest in anything beyond the physical structure of the place. His eyes roamed the walls, the tracks, and even the staff, like someone evaluating pieces on a board before deciding their next move. I'd seen that look before. Cold, sharp, and full of hidden agendas. And every time I saw it, something bad was about to happen. Yet, something was different that night. It wasn't just about business, about buying and selling. There was tension in the air, a dense energy that made the entire park feel complicit in a secret. I didn't know if Robert sensed the danger, or if he somehow believed he was in control. But something told me the control had already slipped from his grasp. And the next step in the investigation would make that painfully clear. Valmont's fame spread faster than any small-town rumor. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to introduce himself. His name was already steeped in stories, and not the kind you tell at parties. To many, he was synonymous with progress. But to others, he was the embodiment of greed. In my line of work, I've learned that reputation is like gunpowder. It only takes a spark to explode. In Robert's case, sparks flew aplenty. Park officials saw him as the enemy who would arrive with paper and pens to decree the end of their lives there. Longtime residents remembered the promises he made and broke. The agreements that began with a smile and ended in court. And there were also those who simply feared him, because they knew he wouldn't back down from anything. I can't ignore the fact that reputation in crimes is almost always the first thread we pull to unravel the plot, and his was full of knots. Among businessmen, competitors, and even former business partners, the list of people who had reason to see him disappear was so long I'd need an entire filing cabinet to write it all down. Not to mention the silent grievances, the ones that never appear in the records but are often the most dangerous. And that night, as I heard whispers and sidelong glances whenever he passed, I realized Robert wasn't surrounded by strangers. He was surrounded by unresolved stories. Some of those stories had faces present in the park. Others still were hidden in the shadows, and I was about to step into those shadows to see what really moved within. The exact moment it all happened was so fast and so silent it bordered on the impossible. The ghost train swallowed the passengers with its first plunge into darkness. And from then on, anything could have happened. I've been to many places where sound and lack of light create the perfect setting for a crime. But here, the combination was almost surgical. The screams, the sound effects, the creaking of the tracks, everything worked to mask any suspicious movement. Robert entered the car and sat in the middle, surrounded by strangers who, seconds later, would be unwitting pieces of a deadly puzzle. The lights flickered and disappeared, revealing only flashes of frightened or distracted faces. I can imagine the killer calculating every turn, every break, waiting for the moment when everyone's attention would be diverted. It wasn't an impulsive act, it was a deliberate execution. What intrigued me most was the coldness with which everything was done. There were no screams, no reaction, no one noticed anything out of the ordinary. Robert remained in his seat, motionless, and only when the train returned to the platform did they realize he was unresponsive. There was no expression of pain on his face. There was no strange posture on his body. It was as if he had fallen asleep, but the precise wound in his chest told a different story. In that instant, it became clear to me that we were no ordinary criminal. Whoever did this knew the place well, knew exactly how to hide behind the chaos, and worse still, knew how to get out without arousing suspicion. The question that tormented me was, who among those shadows had this level of control? The answer, I knew, was still traveling with me on that dark track. When the train returned to the platform, everything seemed normal. Children laughed. Some commented on the most exaggerated scares, and others simply left relieved that it was over. It was only when a staff member tried to wake Robert, thinking he was being funny, that the mood changed. The touch on his hand brought instant silence, The cold skin betrayed that something was very wrong. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Some insisted he had passed out. Others said it was just fatigue or low blood pressure. But I learned that the body speaks, even when the mouth is silent. And Robert's body screamed that life had already left him. The ride operator, pale, tried to understand how this could have happened without anyone noticing. The once joyful crowd now transformed into a sea of confused looks and nervous whispers. Workers began to close off the area, and I felt that familiar heaviness in the air, the abrupt shift in atmosphere that always accompanies death. It was then that I realized, if the killer was there, he was watching everything, mingling among the onlookers, perhaps even feeding on his own work. As I surveyed the scene, I noticed there was no sign of a struggle, sudden movement, or anything else to draw attention to. The death had been discreet, almost respectful, and that made me even more uneasy, because silent crimes require a specific kind of mind, and I was about to dive deep into it. The preliminary report revealed something we already suspected. Robert had been struck in the chest by a small but lethal sharp object. The blow was accurate, direct, and without hesitation. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that he had tried to defend himself. It was as if the attack had occurred in an instant when he hadn't even realized the threat, which for a seasoned killer is the perfect scenario. The detail that caught my attention most was the lack of visible blood. This indicated that the wound had been immediately compressed, perhaps with a cloth or even the attacker's own hand. It's the kind of control that requires composure and a basic understanding of how to avoid making a fuss. This wasn't amateur work, it was almost as if someone had rehearsed it. Mentally reviewing the train's route, I realized how many opportunities the criminal had to act unseen. The sharp curves, the flashing lights, the deafening sounds, everything conspired to make the attack invisible. I'd seen criminals take advantage of chaotic events to act, but here the execution bordered on meticulous. It was as if the killer had sketched out the crime on paper before committing it. And the most disturbing thing was the thought that this person was still among us, possibly walking through the park as if nothing had happened. The murder weapon, until that moment, remained missing. And in cases like this, the weapon can be the key that not only points to the culprit, but reveals something much darker behind the whole story. As strange as it may seem, no one, absolutely no one, reported seeing anything out of the ordinary during the ride. There were no unexpected screams or suspicious movements. Every passenger swore they spent the entire time staring straight ahead, absorbed in the scares the attraction had in store. This is the kind of detail that bothers me deeply, when everyone sees exactly the same thing, or in this case, nothing at all. The ghost train environment was perfect for inducing this collective blindness. Lights flashing at specific moments, loud distracting sounds, scenarios designed to catch our attention at the wrong point. It's as if the ride itself were an accomplice to the crime, guiding our eyes away from what really mattered. I knew that if the killer took advantage of this, he wasn't improvising. He knew every inch of that route. Reviewing the passengers' positions in the car, I noticed something curious. Robert's seat was in an area where the tunnel curved sharply to the right. At that point, the train slowed, and the passenger's peripheral vision was obscured by a play of light and shadow that obscured any lateral movement. If anyone acted there, they did so at the safest possible moment. But there was still a question gnawing at me. Was the killer sitting right next to him, or had he come from somewhere no one expected? This thought opened a new line of investigation, one that would require not only retracing the route, but also entering the mind of whoever used the darkness as a weapon. The carriage on that last trip carried 7 people, including Robert. It was a small train, which made the situation even more intriguing. In theory, the fewer people, the easier it was to notice any strange movements. But here, the opposite happened. No one saw, no one felt, no one suspected, as if everyone had made a silent pact with their own distraction. I scanned the occupied seats one by one. 2 teenagers sat in the front seat, more interested in laughing and teasing each other than observing their surroundings. Behind them sat a couple who seemed to be constantly holding hands, at least that's what they claimed. Robert alone sat in the center, and in the last 2 seats sat a silent man and a woman who couldn't stop looking at her cell phone before the train departed. The physical layout favored the killer. The movement of the train, combined with the seating arrangement, created perfect blind spots. Anyone behind Robert would have easy access, and anyone to his side could act without the others noticing. But there was an even bolder possibility. Someone approached from outside the car, just as he was passing through a specific area. This setup left me with an even greater enigma. 7 people, a tiny train car, and a crime committed without witnesses. To unravel this, I would need to understand not only who was there, but also who had the ability to become invisible in such close proximity. Among all the faces that night, one in particular seemed to carry more than just surprise at what had happened. Samuel Price, the operator of the ghost train, a middle-aged man, with a tired look and calloused hands. He had already worked every screw on that ride. A former park mechanic, he knew the attraction like the back of his hand, and that to me meant he knew exactly where and how an attack could go unnoticed. Samuel had a curious history. He'd already argued with Robert in public, something half the park staff seemed to know about. Sources told me he didn't accept the idea of seeing the park demolished, and that Robert had threatened to fire him if the sale went through. Reason? He had plenty. What remained to be seen was whether he also possessed the composure to turn his resentment into action. Talking to him, I noticed subtle contradictions. He said he hadn't taken his eyes off the control panel the entire ride, but he hesitated when I asked if he noticed any irregularities in the train's speed. The kind of hesitation that only exists when the mind races to create a convincing version of the truth. Furthermore, Samuel avoided looking directly at Robert's body, as if this were more than just an unpleasant scene. What made me uneasy was that Samuel had access to restricted areas, maintenance passages that crisscrossed sections of the tunnel. Perfect places for someone to sneak up on him. Perhaps he was simply a man shaken by the tragedy, or perhaps he was the only one capable of masterminding the crime with such precision. And that doubt wouldn't leave my mind until I explored every corner of that toy. If there's one thing an investigator loves, it's a good security recording. But in the case of the ghost train, what I found was both frustrating and revealing. The cameras only covered the ride's entrance and exit. Inside, the ride was pitch black. No equipment, no visual recording. This could have been due to administrative oversight, or a deliberate decision to keep certain mysteries intact. Reviewing the footage, I noticed that Robert entered alone with a neutral expression, showing no signs of tension. The other passengers seemed equally relaxed, laughing and chatting. Upon exiting, the scene was different. Confused faces, some frightened, and Robert's motionless body only noticed once the train had stopped. The most intriguing thing? No strange figures loitering on the platform, at least not at a visible angle. The lack of internal cameras created an information vacuum that paradoxically spoke volumes to me. Whoever planned the crime knew about this flaw and likely relied on it to act. It's like playing chess blindly. You only take risks if you know exactly where the pieces are, and in the killer's case, the strategy was perfect, acting where there were no eyes to witness it. Still, the exterior footage could contain more subtle clues. A glance exchanged, a quick gesture, someone entering or exiting the ride with an object in hand. I knew I'd have to watch those recordings frame by frame, not to see the crime unfold, but to discover what the criminal did before and after. Because it's in those gaps that the truth often hides. The absence of the murder weapon was like a black hole in the investigation, something that swallowed any attempt at a conclusion. We knew Robert's wound had been caused by a sharp object, but nothing was found in the train car, the tunnel, or the platform. This meant the killer not only acted with precision but also had the time and composure to dispose of the key evidence unnoticed. I've seen cases where the weapon was something unlikely. An umbrella, a piece of decor, even an item from the set itself. In Ghost Train, this possibility was even more real. The environment was full of props that could be transformed into lethal instruments, and anyone could return the weapon to the set without attracting attention. Perhaps it was still there, disguised, waiting for someone to notice it. What worried me was the logistics. The killer needed to act quickly, strike with precision, and then hide the weapon at the same time. There was no room for hesitation. This requires not only composure but also intimate knowledge of the environment and human behavior under pressure. The weapon could have been hidden in someone's pocket, or it could have been left somewhere no one would dare look. What if she was still inside the ride, mingled among the plastic bones and fake walls? This possibility made me decide I'd have to return to the ghost train when it was closed. With no music, no lights, no screams. Just me, the silence, and the shadows. Because it's in these moments that inanimate things sometimes decide to speak. Among the passengers in the last car, One statement caught my attention, that of Laura King, young, well-dressed, with a look of confidence for someone who had just witnessed a death. She claimed she couldn't have done anything because she spent the entire journey holding her boyfriend's hand. A simple sentence, but one that to me sounded like a door half open to a lie. When I asked my boyfriend to confirm, he said the same thing, but with less conviction. There were small pauses in his speech, his eyes wandering. I've learned that when two people repeat a story as if they've rehearsed it, it's probably because they really have. The problem is that rehearsal never covers all the details, and that's when the truth often slips through the cracks. Plus, their seats were close enough that with a quick movement, someone could have hit Robert and returned to their original position before the lights came on. The mere fact that they were together created a natural alibi. Who would suspect a couple holding hands on a horror ride? It was the perfect cover for any calculated action. The question that kept gnawing at me was, why did Laura come so quickly to say she couldn't have done anything? Innocent people answer when asked. Guilty people often answer before the question is asked. I knew I would need to talk to her again, but in a less comfortable setting, one where hands couldn't hide behind well-rehearsed stories. The ghost train wasn't just a toy, it was a sensory trap. Total darkness made the brain search for any speck of light, and loud sounds confused the sense of direction. In this state, people are vulnerable, unable to process all stimuli at once. For a killer, this is a dream scenario. Fear acts like a curtain, hiding what's really happening. During my investigations, I learned that psychological terror can be more effective than any weapon. When the mind is focused on surviving scares and shadows, it ignores important details. A tap on the shoulder can be interpreted as part of the staging, a strange sound as a special effect. It is in this distortion of reality that crimes like this find space to exist. In Robert's case, everything indicated that the killer used this factor to his advantage. He knew no one was thinking about the real danger, that everyone was immersed in the game. This false security is treacherous. It numbs attention, paving the way for quick and silent attacks. I've seen thieves operate in the middle of street shows, taking advantage of the audience's fascination to disappear with wallets and purses. But this wasn't just any robbery. It was a meticulous homicide. And when a crime blends so seamlessly into its surroundings, it's a sign we're not dealing with coincidences. We're dealing with someone who knows how to manipulate the human mind, and who's probably done it before. What kept me awake at night wasn't just figuring out who killed Robert, but how it was done in front of 7 people without any of them noticing. The train car was small, space limited, and yet the killer acted like a ghost. No reaction, no suspicious sounds, nothing to arouse suspicion. It was as if death had crept in quietly, using the train itself as an accomplice. I mentally replayed every second of the journey, where the train slowed, where it turned, where the light flickered. I saw dozens of opportunities, but all of them required almost superhuman timing. A poorly timed strike would have given everything away. This told me the killer knew not only the victim, but also the surroundings. Perhaps he's had even mentally rehearsed it before striking. The biggest mystery was the gun's disappearance. No matter how much I considered the possibilities, each one required extraordinary skill. The criminal had to inflict the wound, conceal the weapon, and return to its original position in seconds, without anyone looking the wrong way. It wasn't just a physical attack. It was criminal choreography. And this thought led me to a disturbing conclusion. The enigma wasn't just finding the killer, but understanding the mind that was capable of transforming a banal stroll into a perfect crime. And to decipher it, I would have to enter this psychological labyrinth at the risk of not finding the way out alone. The park where the ghost train once stood had more than just the smell of rust and old wood. It carried a dark past. In the 1970s, an employee was electrocuted inside the attraction, and the incident was covered up by management at the time. Officially, it was an accident, but older residents tell different stories. Stories that mix neglect, silence, and even strange rituals performed in the wee hours. Over the decades, other curious incidents have occurred there. Visitors swore they heard voices calling their names, maintenance doors closing by themselves, shadows appearing where there was no light. I've learned not to rule anything out, because even when a mystery seems supernatural, it usually hides a very human motive behind it. And sometimes those motives are scarier than any ghost. What intrigued me was the ghost train's persistence in withstanding the test of time. While other attractions were being refurbished or dismantled, it remained virtually intact, as if untouched. This could simply be a historical attachment, or it could mean there was something there that certain people didn't want changed. And in this case, preserving the ride was like preserving a secret. The deeper I delved into this past, the more I realized that Robert's death wasn't isolated. Perhaps it was just another chapter in a story that began long before he set foot there. And if I was right, the killer wasn't the only one who knew those shadows well. They'd been trained to hide truths for decades. When we searched Robert's body, we found something in his inside jacket pocket that completely changed the course of the investigation. A handwritten note, written in firm, cold letters. It simply said, "The night will swallow you, and no one will notice." There was no signature, no sign of haste in the writing. It was as if the writer was absolutely certain the message would reach its recipient and that it would be fulfilled. Notes like these carry more than words. They carry intent. The tone wasn't threatening, but prophetic. This indicated the crime was premeditated and that the victim knew somehow he was in danger. But if he did, why didn't he ask for help, or worse? Did Robert think he could even negotiate with his tormentor? The paper smelled faintly of smoke. Not cigarette smoke, but the typical ghost train tunnel odor, infused with the constant use of special effects. This meant the note had either been written there or had been on the ride before reaching Robert. The connection between the message and the crime scene was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. I'd seen killers leave signature notes before, as if to imprint their name on the scene without using letters. The problem was that this time, the handwriting wasn't just a clue, it was a provocation. And I couldn't ignore the feeling that this note wasn't the only one. Perhaps others were scattered around, waiting to be found. Amidst the testimonies, an isolated detail caught my attention. A visitor reported seeing a gloved hand move quickly behind Robert's seat, but thought it was part of the act. This phrase, thrown out almost casually, set off a warning bell in my mind. In investigations, seemingly inconsequential details are often the central pieces of the puzzle. I asked about the color of the glove, the shape of the hand, any clue that could transform it from detail to evidence. He hesitated, as if trying to recall a blurred memory. He said he wasn't sure if the glove was black or dark, and that he saw it for less than a second, but long enough to notice a sudden movement, unlike the smooth mechanics of programmed scares. The most curious part was the timing of the moment he claimed to have seen it. Right on the curve where the train was slowing down, the same one I had already identified as the ideal spot for the attack. The coincidence was too great to ignore, and if he saw a hand, then there was someone close enough to Robert to act, even if that person wasn't necessarily sitting next to him. However, there was a risk in following this lead. Human memory is treacherous. Under adrenaline, the brain fills in gaps with assumptions. I needed to confirm whether this gloved hand was real or just the result of a misinterpreted scare. And to do that, I would have to recreate the exact moment, in the same place under the same conditions. As I pieced together the pieces, I began to consider an uncomfortable hypothesis. What if it wasn't a lone killer? Several elements pointed to a coordinated action. The perfect timing, the disappearance of the weapon, the lack of witnesses. All of this would be much easier if more than one person were involved. And when there's a conspiracy, the lines between the guilty and the innocent become dangerously blurred. Imagine two accomplices, one to distract, one to act, or perhaps someone inside the toy and another outside, coordinating every move. This would explain how the attack was so precise and how the weapon disappeared without anyone noticing. The logistics would become more plausible, but it would also multiply the number of suspects. The problem is that in conspiracies, each participant only knows part of the truth. This means that to understand the whole, I would need to break their loyalty. And there's no such thing as eternal loyalty when the fear of being caught starts to weigh heavily. My job would be to plant doubt, to make each participant believe the other had already said more than they should have. If this hypothesis were correct, then I wasn't hunting a criminal. I was dismantling a net. And nets by nature extend further than the eye can see. Maybe the killer wasn't even in the train car. Maybe he was pulling the strings from somewhere even more hidden. The more I investigated, the more the feeling that something wasn't quite right haunted me. The crime had happened too quickly for someone sitting in the train car, yet so precisely it seemed rehearsed. It was then that, revisiting the park's old plans, I discovered a detail almost everyone had forgotten. A technical access point, hidden behind a false panel, right on the curve where the train slows down. A perfect spot for someone to enter and exit without being seen. This entrance led to a narrow corridor that connected to the backstage area of the attraction. There I found fresh footprints and a cloth with traces of what could have been dried blood. The hypothesis that the killer had come from inside the structure, not a passenger, was gaining ground. This would explain how the attack was so quick and how the weapon disappeared without a trace in the train car. The most disturbing thing was realizing that the entrance wasn't locked. This meant any employee or former employee could have used that path. And if someone knew the attraction well, they knew exactly when the train would pass slowly, creating the perfect opening to act. Suddenly, the list of suspects grew, and the case was no longer just about who was on the ride. The twist, however, came with a final discovery. This same access had already been used in the past, in the 1970s accident. In other words, today's crime not only repeated a pattern, but also appeared to be a continuation of something that began decades ago. And this connection between past and present was still far from being fully explained. And so, once again, the truth hid in the shadows. But this time, we managed to shine a light. The ghost train killer case showed that behind every silence and every inattentive glance, there may be a story no one wants told. In the end, understanding the crime was more than piecing together clues. It was entering the mind of someone who used fear as a weapon and darkness as an ally. Now I want to know, if you were in that car, would you have noticed anything? Would you have suspected whoever was next to you, or whoever didn't even seem to be there? How often in your daily life do you ignore small signs because you're distracted by the noise around you? Perhaps what I learned in this case will apply to you too. Danger rarely announces itself with alarm. The most disturbing thing is to think that, as we speak, there are people studying exactly how to manipulate our attention to act without being seen. This applies to crimes, business, and even personal lives. What can you do starting now to see beyond the obvious and not be just another spectator in your own story? If this investigation made you think differently, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following cases that defy logic. Like and comment on what you think really happened. Because, after all, the investigation only ends when all the pieces are in place, and maybe you have the missing piece.